They cut her hair with dull scissors while she sat trembling in a cell that stank of human waste and rotting straw, and when the executioner's assistant held up the white locks to show the crowd gathering outside, someone in the street below laughed and shouted that the Austrian whore finally looked like the peasant she always despised. Marie Antoinette, former Queen of France, sat in a stone tomb barely wider than a coffin, her hands bound so tightly the rope had worn through her skin, while 2 guards stared at her without blinking, watching her every movement, refusing to turn away even when she squatted over the chamber pot in the corner. Her white chemise hiked up around her waist as they made crude jokes about what royalty looked like when it bleeds. This wasn't just an execution. This was a performance of humiliation so precise, so calculated in its cruelty, that it makes modern torture look almost merciful by comparison. The revolutionaries didn't just want her dead, they wanted her destroyed, stripped of every shred of dignity, reduced to something less than human before the blade finally did its work. The Conciergerie wasn't a prison, it was a waiting room for death, and Marie Antoinette's cell was designed specifically to break her spirit before her body followed. The records show it measured roughly 3 meters by 2, but what the official documents don't tell you is that the walls wept with condensation, that rats the size of small cats scurried across her feet at night, or that the smell of the Seine River mixed with human excrement created an atmosphere so thick you could taste it in the back of your throat. She slept on straw that was changed maybe once a week, if she was lucky straw that became matted with her own menstrual blood, because the guards refused to give her clean rags, claiming that royal cunts didn't deserve special treatment. The prison doctor's notes, carefully preserved in the archives, mention uterine hemorrhaging so severe that she bled through her dress daily, leaving dark stains that the guards would point at and mock, asking if this was the famous Austrian water finally running out. They fed her bread so hard it cracked her teeth, soup that was little more than dirty water with floating bits of God knows what, and when she complained of the cold, they told her that perhaps she should have thought about that before spending France's money on diamond necklaces and silk stockings. But the real torture wasn't physical. It was the surveillance, the complete and utter annihilation of privacy that drove her closer to madness with each passing day. 2 gendarmes sat inside her cell at all times, never more than a few feet away, their eyes following her every movement like hawks watching a wounded rabbit. When she needed to change her blood-soaked undergarments, they watched. When she wept into her hands at night, they watched. When she tried to wash herself with the single bucket of cold water they gave her each morning, they watched and made comments about how even naked she looked old and used up, how her breasts sagged like empty purses, how the revolution had turned her into exactly what she deserved to be. Nothing. She couldn't even relieve herself without an audience, squatting over that foul chamber pot while they discussed her body as if she were livestock being evaluated for slaughter. One guard reportedly told his replacement that he'd seen horses with better figures, and they both laughed while she sat there, shaking with humiliation and rage, unable to do anything but endure. The psychological warfare extended beyond her cell walls. Revolutionary authorities deliberately denied her any news of her children, leaving her to imagine the worst possible fates for them in her isolation. Her son, the young Dauphin, had been taken from her months earlier and placed in the care of a cobbler who was instructed to turn the boy against his mother, to teach him revolutionary songs that mocked Marie Antoinette as a treasonous whore. The child was kept in a room directly below hers, close enough that she could sometimes hear his voice through the stone floor, but she was forbidden from seeing him, from touching him, from telling him she loved him one last time. Guards would sometimes mention casually that they'd heard the boy crying, or that he'd asked about his mother, just to watch her face crumble with grief. When she tried to smuggle a letter to her sister-in-law, a simple note that said nothing more than she had nothing left to hope for in this world, it was intercepted and read aloud to the prison staff as evening entertainment. They mocked her handwriting, her spelling, her desperate tone, turning her final attempt at human connection into just another source of amusement for men who had long ago stopped seeing her as anything resembling a person. The trial was a farce so grotesque that even some of the revolutionaries in attendance felt their stomachs turn. though they'd never admit it publicly because sympathy for royalty could get your own head measured for the national razor. Marie Antoinette stood before the Revolutionary Tribunal on October 14, 1793, dressed in a black mourning dress that hung loose on her skeletal frame, her white hair barely covered by a simple bonnet, and the charges read against her were so ludicrous, so deliberately designed to enrage the mob, that they would have been laughable if they weren't about to get her killed. Treason, yes, expected. Correspondence with foreign powers, sure, probably true. But incest with her own son? The revolutionaries had tortured that confession out of an 8-year-old boy, coaching him to describe sexual acts he couldn't possibly understand. All so they could paint Marie Antoinette not just as a political enemy but as a moral monster so depraved that her execution would seem like a mercy to France. When the accusation was read aloud, the prosecutor, Antoine Quentin Fouquier-Tinville, a man whose face looked like melted candle wax and whose breath reportedly smelled of spoiled wine, watched her reaction with visible excitement, hoping to see her break down, to scream, to give him something theatrical for the crowd. Instead, she stood silent for a long moment, her hands gripping the wooden rail in front of her so tightly her knuckles went white, and then she said simply, "I appeal to all mothers." Those 5 words created a silence in that courtroom that apparently lasted several seconds, a brief crack in the revolutionary fervor where even the most hardened Jacobins had to confront what they were actually doing. Accusing a mother of raping her own child based on testimony extracted through psychological torture of that same child. But the moment passed quickly because revolution doesn't run on empathy. It runs on momentum. And there were too many people invested in her death to let something as inconvenient as human decency get in the way. The trial continued for 2 days, a parade of witnesses who testified to things they'd heard second-hand or third-hand, who brought up letters that proved nothing except that Marie Antoinette had opinions about politics, which was apparently a crime when you were a woman born in the wrong country. Her defense lawyer, a man assigned to her just hours before the trial began, was so ineffective he might as well have been a potted plant. And when he tried to argue that the evidence was circumstantial at best, he was shouted down by spectators who'd been specifically selected for their revolutionary zeal. The verdict was decided before the trial even started. Everyone knew that, including Marie Antoinette herself. When they pronounced her guilty at 4 in the morning on October 16th and sentenced her to death by guillotine, she showed no reaction, no tears, no pleas for mercy, nothing. She just stood there with her hands still bound behind her back, swaying slightly from exhaustion and blood loss, and waited for them to take her back to her cell for the final few hours of her life. Those last hours were spent in complete silence, the guards having been instructed not to speak to her, not to respond to anything she said, to treat her as if she were already a corpse. She was given a piece of paper and a pencil to write a final letter to her sister-in-law, and in shaky handwriting that betrayed her deteriorating physical condition, she wrote about forgiveness, about her children, about how she hoped her death would bring peace to France. The letter was confiscated immediately and never delivered, filed away in some revolutionary archive where it sat unread for decades, just another piece of paper in a government that produced mountains of paperwork about the people it murdered. At 7 in the morning, they came for her. The executioner's assistant, a man whose job was specifically to prepare condemned prisoners for the blade, entered her cell with scissors and cut her hair short, hacking away at the white locks without any care for technique or comfort, occasionally nicking her scalp and letting the blood run down her neck. Marie Antoinette, who had once spent hours having her hair styled into elaborate constructions decorated with feathers and jewels, sat motionless as this stranger butchered her hair with all the grace of someone shearing a sheep. Then they bound her hands behind her back, tighter than before, and led her out into the prison courtyard where an open wooden cart waited. This was the final humiliation, the detail that really drove home how far she'd fallen. Her husband, King Louis XVII, had been taken to his execution in a closed carriage, afforded at least that small dignity in his final journey. But Marie Antoinette, The woman they blamed for everything wrong with France was thrown into a cart used for common criminals, murderers, thieves, prostitutes, and told to sit on a plank of wood, worn smooth by the bodies of countless others who had made this same journey. The ride to the Place de la Révolution took over an hour, deliberately slow so that as many Parisians as possible could see the fallen queen in her degradation. The cart bounced over cobblestones, each jolt sending pain through her hemorrhaging body, while thousands of people lined the streets to watch. Some shouted insults, calling her whore, traitor, Austrian bitch. Others just stared in silence, perhaps processing the surreal image of a woman who'd once been untouchable, now reduced to this. A bleeding, exhausted ghost being paraded through the streets like a carnival attraction. Jacques Roux, a radical revolutionary priest who observed the procession, noted in his diary that Marie Antoinette kept her head raised and her eyes forward, refusing to look at the crowds, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. When the cart finally stopped at the scaffold, Henri Sanson, the executioner, helped her climb the steps, and in that moment, she accidentally stepped on his foot. Her final words, recorded in his deposition and confirmed by multiple witnesses, were an apology. "Pardon me, sir. I did not do it on purpose." Even at the edge of death, even after everything they'd done to her, she apologized to the man about to kill her. At 12:15 p.m., the blade fell and the crowd erupted in shouts of "Vive la République!" But several observers noted a strange moment of silence immediately after, as if the city itself had briefly held its breath. They threw her body into a wooden coffin without ceremony and buried her in an unmarked mass grave with hundreds of other executed prisoners, her head tossed in separately, because that's how they did things during the terror, efficiently and without sentiment. It would take 22 years before anyone bothered to dig up her remains and give her a proper burial. And by then, identifying which bones belonged to which victim was largely a matter of educated guessing. The revolution had consumed its most famous symbol, chewed her up and spit her out, and in doing so, revealed exactly what human beings are capable of when they decide that justice